It was a chilly Friday evening when Sarah and James decided to treat themselves to a night out. Life hadn't been easy for them lately. Both were juggling multiple jobs just to make ends meet, but tonight, they wanted to forget all of that. They saved up for weeks to enjoy dinner at a fancy restaurant they'd heard so much about. Dressed in their best outfits, they walked in, excited yet nervous. The restaurant was bustling, with soft music playing in the background and an air of sophistication that felt almost intimidating. They were seated by the window, and, as they looked at the menu, their eyes lit up. This was their moment to indulge a little. When the waiter finally arrived at their table, Sarah and James greeted him with warm smiles, their excitement bubbling just beneath the surface. He was a tall man, immaculately dressed in a crisp white shirt and black vest, with a polished appearance that matched the elegance of the restaurant. Yet, there was something cold about him. His eyes seemed to pass right through them, and his demeanor carried an air of indifference. He placed the menus on the table with a quick motion, avoiding eye contact. "I'll give you a moment," he said flatly, walking away without so much as a glance at their eager faces. Sarah looked at James and shrugged, brushing off the slight unease. "Maybe he's just having a bad day," she said softly, determined not to let anything dampen their evening. They spent a few minutes, poring over the menu, whispering to each other and weighing their options. The prices were higher than they'd expected, but this was their special night. After a quiet discussion, they decided on a small appetizer, a single entree to share, and 2 glasses of water. It was modest, but it was enough to make them feel like they were treating themselves. When the waiter returned, his notepad in hand, Sarah smiled and gave their order. "Just 1 entree? To share?" the waiter asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. He raised an eyebrow, his judgment as clear as the candles flickering on the table. Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced down, suddenly self-conscious, but James straightened in his seat, his tone calm but firm. "Yes, it's all we need, thank you." The waiter let out a barely concealed sigh, scribbled on his notepad and muttered something under his breath. He turned on his heel and walked away without another word. Sarah looked at James, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he's annoyed with us?" James reached across the table and took her hand. "Let him be. This is our night. We're here to enjoy ourselves." She nodded, forcing a smile, but the knot in her stomach tightened. As the evening wore on, the waiter's attitude became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his initial lack of warmth, his actions seemed intentionally dismissive. He brought their appetizer late, setting it down with a clatter and a perfunctory "enjoy." When they politely asked for a refill on their water, he sighed audibly before trudging off to fulfill their request. Sarah tried to focus on the moment, on the small joys of being out with James, but she couldn't help noticing the waiter whispering to another staff member near the bar. Both glanced in their direction, their smirks barely concealed. One of them chuckled, shaking his head. "James," Sarah murmured, leaning closer. "They're talking about us." James followed her gaze and saw the looks. His jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Let them. They don't know us, and they don't matter." Still, the humiliation hung heavy in the air. Sarah kept her head down as she ate, focusing on the food, a meal she would have otherwise savored. Each bite tasted bittersweet now, tainted by the sneering glances and whispered remarks. When their shared entree arrived, the waiter placed it between them with exaggerated precision, his lips curling into a faint, sarcastic smile. "Here you go, enjoy." His tone was clipped, almost mocking. Sarah forced a polite "thank you," though her voice wavered. They did their best to tune out the negativity, focusing instead on each other. They talked about their dreams, their plans, and the little things that made life worthwhile. Despite the stares, they found moments of joy in their shared meal, reminding themselves why they were there, to celebrate each other. When the bill arrived, they examined it carefully, knowing every dollar counted. They had agreed beforehand to split the cost equally, each using their own card. As Sarah handed over her card, the waiter frowned. "Seriously?" he asked, holding up the 2 cards. "You're splitting this?" His tone was incredulous, as if they had committed some great offense. Sarah froze, her face flushing with shame. James reached out, his voice tight with restraint. "Yes, that's right." The waiter rolled his eyes dramatically, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Sarah blinked back tears, staring down at the table. James leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "Hey," he said, tilting her chin up. "Don't let him get to you. Tonight's about us. No one else." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. But deep down, the sting of that evening would linger for a long time. The memory of that evening never left Sarah and James. It wasn't the taste of the food or the beauty of the restaurant that stayed with them. It was the sting of being made to feel small, unworthy of the space they had worked so hard to afford. It hurt, but that pain became their fuel. Late at night, after long shifts at their respective jobs, they would sit together in their tiny apartment, sipping tea and talking about their dream. They envisioned a restaurant where everyone, no matter how much or how little they could afford, would be treated with respect and kindness. "Someday," Sarah would say, her eyes glowing with determination, "we'll create a place where people feel at home, where no one will ever feel judged for sharing a meal or splitting a bill." And so, they began the hard work of turning that dream into reality. Sarah took on extra shifts at the cafe where she worked, while James juggled multiple jobs, from driving deliveries to working late nights in a warehouse. Their weekends were spent learning everything they could about running a business, attending free workshops, reading books on restaurant management, and shadowing mentors who believed in their vision. Every penny they earned went into their savings account. It wasn't easy. There were days when exhaustion nearly broke them and moments when doubt crept in. But they held on to each other and the dream that kept them going. After years of sacrifice, the day finally came. With the little savings they had and a small business loan, they opened the doors to their very own restaurant. It wasn't a grand, luxurious establishment, but it was everything they had hoped for. The walls were painted in warm, inviting colors, with handwritten signs that welcomed customers as if they were family. The menu was simple yet thoughtful, filled with dishes that carried meaning and comfort. Every detail, from the cozy booths to the cheerful music playing in the background, spoke of love and care. On their opening day, Sarah and James stood hand in hand, watching as their first customers walked through the door. "We did it," James whispered, squeezing Sarah's hand. She nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "We really did." The restaurant had been running for a few months, steadily growing in popularity. Customers loved the warm atmosphere and the way Sarah and James treated everyone like old friends. People often complimented them, saying, "It feels like you've poured your heart into this place." And they had. One quiet evening, just as the dinner rush was winding down, the door creaked open, and in walked a man who seemed oddly familiar. He looked around the restaurant hesitantly, as though unsure whether he belonged there. His once polished appearance was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. There was a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him immediately, the waiter from that fateful night years ago. Her heart raced as the memory came flooding back, sharp and vivid. But instead of anger, she felt a strange mix of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and most of all, a quiet resolve. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and approached him with the same warmth she offered every customer. "Welcome to our restaurant," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Table for one?" The man looked up, startled. For a moment he just stared at her, as though trying to place her face. Then his eyes widened. "You," he began, his voice faltering. "You own this place?" "Yes," came a familiar voice behind her. James stepped forward, standing beside Sarah with an easy confidence. "We do." The man's face turned a deep shade of red. He fidgeted with the edge of his shirt sleeve, unable to meet their gaze. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't realize, I never thought." His words trailed off, leaving an awkward silence between them. Sarah and James exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding passing between them. "It's okay," Sarah said gently. "Everyone makes mistakes." She gestured to an open table. "Please, have a seat. Let us take care of you tonight." The man hesitated, clearly overwhelmed, but something in their kindness disarmed him, and he finally nodded, walking over to the table they had prepared. As Sarah handed him a menu, she noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Take your time," she said softly, offering him a reassuring smile. "There's no rush." For the first time in years, the man felt seen, not judged, not dismissed, but genuinely seen. And as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the restaurant Sarah and James had built, he couldn't help but reflect on how much things had changed. Sarah and James stood side by side as the man sat at the table, his posture hesitant, and his expression a mixture of shame and disbelief. They exchanged a quiet glance, a mutual understanding passing between them. This moment wasn't about retribution or holding a grudge. It was about being the people they had always aspired to be. Kind, compassionate, and forgiving. Sarah approached the man and gently placed a menu in front of him. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. "Everyone deserves a good meal," she said softly, her warm smile reassuring. "Order whatever you like. It's on the house." The man looked up at her, his lips trembling as he tried to form words. His eyes glistened with tears he didn't bother to hide. He lowered his head, ashamed, and ran a hand over his face as if to steady himself. For a moment, he didn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah simply nodded and stepped away, giving him space to collect himself. James, who had been quietly observing, walked over and placed a glass of water in front of the man. "Take your time," he said gently. "No rush." As the man opened the menu, his hands trembled slightly. He hadn't expected kindness, least of all from the people he had wronged so deeply years ago. The weight of his past actions bore down on him, and for the first time in a long while, he truly reflected on who he had been. As he waited for his meal, memories of that night came rushing back. The way he had dismissed Sarah and James, the judgment in his tone, the cruel whispers with his colleagues. He had been younger then, confident in his job, perhaps too confident. He had looked down on them for sharing a meal and splitting the bill, never once considering the circumstances of their lives. Now, sitting in their restaurant, he felt the full sting of his actions. When his food arrived, he couldn't hold back the tears any longer. It wasn't just the food, it was the kindness. The quiet, unspoken message that he was still worthy of grace, despite his mistakes. Sarah and James didn't bring up the past. They didn't need to. Their actions spoke louder than words ever could. Forgiveness wasn't about making someone feel bad, it was about letting go of bitterness and choosing to rise above it. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite, not just because the food was good, but because it was given freely, without judgment. It was the kind of care he hadn't shown Sarah and James when they were in his position. When he finished, he stood by the door, hesitating for a moment. He turned back, his eyes red and filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking, "for everything." Sarah stepped forward, her smile genuine and warm. "Take care," she said softly. James joined her, echoing her words. "Take care." Their voices were steady, free of resentment, and filled with sincerity. They meant it with all their hearts. As the man walked out into the night, Sarah and James watched him go, feeling a sense of peace wash over them. They hadn't just served a meal that night, they had offered a moment of redemption, for him and for themselves. Standing together in the restaurant they had built with love and perseverance, Sarah leaned into James and whispered, "I think we made the right choice." James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, nodding. Kindness always is. The couple's restaurant became a beacon of kindness in the community. Their story inspired others to dream big, work hard, and most importantly, treat everyone with respect. Because in the end, it's not the size of the bill or the fanciness of the place that matters. It's the love and humanity we bring to the table. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us create more inspiring content like this. So don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need a little motivation today, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories. And hey, tap that notification bell so you never miss out on new uploads. Together, let's spread positivity and kindness.